In this segment, we're going to focus on making our JavaScript just a little bit more dynamic. As you can see, I've already created a form which you can view inside the web browser preview here, and you can see the code in the brackets integrated development environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this form a little more dynamic so that each field is required. Now let's think a little bit more about how this occurs. If the user doesn't type anything in a field and then leaves that field by clicking on the next field, that's when we want to see if the field is empty. So we're going to write the code to do that for each field. So first of all, we have to deal with the event that's occurring. When the user loses focus, or when a field loses focus, that event is called a blur. So we're going to be working with the onBlur event. So let's go ahead here into the head of our document, and we're going to create a script tag, someplace where we can put some JavaScript. And let's go ahead and run some code when the page initializes. So we're going to use window onload equals function. So this will run when the window loads. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the elements that we're going to be dealing with, and we're going to put them in local variables. The elements are this input that's ID'd as first, this input that's ID'd as last, and this input that's ID'd as email. And we've got to get those out of the HTML and set those to variables in JavaScript. So let's go ahead and declare these here inside the script but outside the function, which will essentially make them global, accessible from anywhere. So email, we're going to declare first name, and we're going to declare last name. Now, that just declares the variable. It isn't assigned any particular value. So here, we're going to use document getElementById email. So getElementById email gets the element with the ID email, which is this input. We're then going to get the first name. Let's make sure we spell this right. Document getElementById. You can see how helpful, by the way, the integrated design environment is as I type. Notice it almost, if I know what command I'm after, fills this out for me. So now we've got these three fields. Now realize that this represents the field, not what's inside the field, because that's going to occur on blur. So here we're going to say, let's start with first. Let's just make this simple and put this in the same order as the fields appear. That's better. So what we want to do is here on the first field, we want to set an onBlur event. So on first, we're going to add an event listener. The event is called blur. And when the blur occurs, we're going to call a function called firstBlur, meaning the first name field is blurring. Now there's a third argument here that for our purposes will always be false. There are a few cases in which it will be true. We're not going to run into them in the course of this activity. So here, we're addressing first. Now remember, first now represents this first name field right here on line 46. We're adding an event listener to listen for the blur event when it loses focus. And then we'll call a function called firstBlur. So let's write the firstBlur function. And for now, let's just do this. We'll alert out firstBlur. This is a good time to actually test our code and see if what we have is working so far. I recommend testing as you go instead of waiting all the way till the end when you finish developing something to test, because it's much easier to find your errors. So if we did everything right here, let's go ahead and get a live preview here. I'll bring that over. So there, and we get the firstBlur event. So watch carefully. We're in the first field. It's going to lose its focus when I close on the last field or the email field. We'll click the last field, and there the firstBlur event occurs. So now what we need to do is, instead of alerting out this firstBlur, we want to see, is the field empty? And if it is, we want to alert the user. So we're going to say here, if first dot value is equal to blank, or first dot value is equal to, and in this case, we're going to say null. Then we're going to alert the user. You need to supply a first name. All right, let's save this again. And what we're saying here now is when the first blur occurs, the user's tagged out of the field, we're going to check the value that's in that field. Remember, because we're just getting the field here with first, we're going to get the value. And if it's a blank string or null, then we're going to alert out you need to supply a first name. Let's go ahead and test. Bring in our form. Okay, so first I'm going to type something in here, and nothing happens. Now let's leave it blank. And we get the alert, you need to supply a first name. So that works fine. Blank, you need to supply a first name. If there's characters in here, it lets it go. So again, what's happening here is when first blur occurs, when we tab out of the field, it's checking the value inside that field, and if it's blank, or if it's null, alert out this message. I know there's a lot of code in this lesson. You may want to watch it more than once to make sure you get everything. Now, instead of doing this, let's say we wanted to change the field to red. So let's go ahead and change the first field to red. So we want to give that background color red. So here, instead of alerting out, we're going to say first dot. And now what we're going to do is we're going to change the style dot background. Notice, see how it's helping here? Color. And we're going to assign that to a value. So let's make it red, FF0000. Good. So now let's test again. Notice how frequently I'm testing my code. And let's bring it in. All right, so first let's test where we put some content in the field. So I'll type my name. That worked. Now let's leave it blank. And it turned red. But we've got a problem. Watch this. It doesn't change back no matter what we do. The background stays red. So what we have to do is we have to create another situation. Here, if this is true, meaning it's blank or null, then we'll do this. So now I have to say if that's false, meaning there's something in the field, we'll do something else. So in this case, you're probably guessing where we're going to go here. First, if I can spell it right, style dot background color equals, and you'll remember that white is FF. All right, so now let's go back and look at the live preview again. Bring this guy over. So now, if we leave the field blank, it should turn red. But if we go back and type something, it should turn white again. So now we've got our field dynamically responding to what the user does due to our JavaScript. Now we just need to apply this same logic to the other two fields. So first thing we're going to do is add the events. Last, add event listener. Blur is the event. And this time we're going to call it last blur. False. And then email. Add event listener. Blur. And we'll call this email blur. False. So now the next step, we need to write two more functions. Now, since these functions are very similar to first blur, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to use copy and paste. So we'll copy this, and we'll go ahead and call this one last blur. The order of these doesn't matter. And then we'll go ahead and paste again, and I'll call this one email blur. Now, within the functions themselves, I've got to change the properties, because this is reading the email value. And we also have to change it here. and here. But this is a whole lot easier than having to type the whole function over again. And I actually recommend coding this way. We knew that the first one worked. We knew that the first blur function worked. So the last blur function should work too if we just make the necessary changes. And if it doesn't work, we know where to look for the error. Again, we're eliminating or limiting the possibility of error. This is last blur, so instead of first, these should be last. Now, by the way, if you're experienced at JavaScript and watching this video, I know there's more efficient ways of doing this. But this is a great way for a beginner to see exactly what's happening. You actually could do all of this in one function if you wanted to. But that's a little more advanced. All right, so now we've got all of our JavaScript. So we've got our first, last, and email referring to document get element by ID, these HTML elements, right? First, last, and email. So once we've got those, then we're going to set up listeners. If we get back up there in the code, right here, so the blur event, when the user leaves that field, calls a function. The first blur, last blur, and email blur function. These functions test if the field is blank by testing for an empty string or a null. Different browsers might give an empty string or a null, so we have got to respond to both possibilities. If that's true, if it's blank, we'll change the background color to red. If it's false, we'll change the background color to white. And we'll do that with all these functions for all three fields. All right, so let's run it through one last test. It'll be one last test if it works. Test again if it doesn't. So here, let's type something in each field and make sure nothing happens. All right, so we typed first name, last name, and email, and nothing changed. Now let's go ahead to red. So if we leave the fields blank, they turn red. If we type something in, they turn white again. So here we've created a more dynamic form that interacts with the styles within the page using JavaScript.